Please Please Me. Please Please Me is the debut album of the Beatles, and most of it was recorded in a single day. February 11th, 1963, Abbey Road Studios, nearly 10 hours straight. Before that day, they had already played over 1,000 live shows. Hamburg, Liverpool, sticky-floored clubs with half-empty rooms. They had earned this moment through pure repetition. But when they finally walked into Studio 2, they showed up exhausted. John Lennon had a bad cold. He was sucking throat lozenges between takes. And yet, the music is raw and bursting and alive in a way that no amount of studio polish could have manufactured. This is rock and roll with a British accent and something underneath it. A hunger that you either have or you don't. The album mixes originals with covers, showing a band that had absorbed everything around them. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, the Everly Brothers, and was already doing something no one else was doing with those influences. By the time they got to the last track of the night, Twist and Shout, John's voice was already shredding itself apart. George Martin told him to just go for it. One take, because there wasn't going to be a second. John later said it nearly killed him. You can still hear it, every last scrape of it, on the record. It doesn't sound polished. It sounds like something real, captured right before it burned itself out. With the Beatles. Less than 8 months later, they did it again. With the Beatles arrived on November 22nd, 1963, the same day Kennedy was shot. The world was changing faster than anyone knew how to process, and so were they. The songwriting got tighter, the harmonies went deeper. John and Paul were developing something that was starting to feel almost telepathic, finishing each other's ideas before the other had put them into words. George got his first real moment, contributing his first ever composition to a Beatles album. The covers were still there, but the originals were quietly taking over. Robert Freeman's cover photograph, four faces half lit in shadow, became one of the most imitated images in the history of music. They hadn't released their second album yet, and already people were studying them. This wasn't a band repeating itself. This was a band accelerating towards something none of them could see, but all of them could feel. If you care about the real story behind the Beatles, not just the hits, but the moments that built them, subscribe now. This channel is going album by album, all the way through. A Hard Day's Night, the first album made entirely of original Lennon-McCartney compositions. No covers, no filler, just 13 songs written by two people who had somehow become the most important songwriters on the planet without quite realizing it yet. The album came with a film of the same name, directed by Richard Lester, shot in black and white, funny and anarchic, and unlike anything that had come before it. It captured Beatlemania from the inside. Four people trapped by their own fame, running from screaming crowds, hiding in hotel rooms, staring out of train windows at a world they could no longer walk through. The music matched that energy perfectly. Fast, clever, slightly exhausted but refusing to show it. The opening chord of the title track, that famous ringing crash of guitar, is one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of recorded music. People have been arguing for 60 years about exactly which notes are in it. The world was screaming at them, and they turned that chaos into something extraordinary. Beatles for Sale. Exhaustion sounds like this. By late 1964, the band was running on fumes. Touring, filming, recording, press, interviews, travel, repeat. A schedule that would have destroyed most people, and was quietly starting to cost something in all of them. Beatles for Sale is honest about that tiredness in a way the earlier records weren't. The covers came back, not because they ran out of ideas, but because they ran out of time. And the originals carry a weight the earlier ones didn't. No Reply opens the album like a short story. I'm a Loser has John admitting something publicly he'd been carrying privately. There's a genuine melancholy underneath the rock and roll here that hadn't been there before. The album cover shows them looking worn, staring past the camera. They were 24 years old and already tired of what they'd built. That tension between enormous success and genuine exhaustion gives this album an honesty that makes it more interesting than it usually gets credit for. Help. John Lennon said later that the title track was a real cry for help dressed up as a pop song. He'd needed it slowed way down to hear the desperation in it. At the tempo the label wanted, it just sounded like another smash. That tension runs through the whole album. On the surface, Help is bright and fun and commercial. Underneath, something is shifting. The band is bigger than any band had ever been, and it's starting to feel like a cage. John's weight, his drinking, his increasingly complicated inner world, none of it had anywhere to go except into the music. Yesterday is Paul at his most purely melodic. Ticket to Ride introduces a heaviness to the guitars that points forward. Bob Dylan had happened to them in 1964 and changed how they thought about lyrics, what a pop song was allowed to say, what it was allowed to feel. This is the last album that sounds like the early Beatles, a last breath before the dive. If you're starting to see how fast they evolved, make sure you're subscribed, because this transformation only gets deeper from here. Rubber Soul. Everything changed here. Rubber Soul is the moment the Beatles stopped being a pop band and became artists. And the difference is not subtle. The shift happened fast and it never went back. The lyrics grew up overnight. Norwegian Wood tells the story of an affair in language so elliptical and clever it took years for people to fully decode. In My Life is a meditation on memory and mortality, written by a 25-year-old that somehow sounds like it came from someone already looking back on a full life. The instrumentation expanded in ways that felt almost accidental. George brought a sitar into the room because he'd been exploring Indian classical music, and nobody told him not to. George Martin contributed a Baroque piano solo that he recorded at half speed and then sped up to sound like a harpsichord. They were inventing techniques because the ones they needed didn't exist yet. Brian Wilson heard Rubber Soul and went into the studio to make Pet Sounds. Paul McCartney heard Pet Sounds and went into the studio to make Sgt. Pepper, a chain reaction that reshaped everything. Revolver. If Rubber Soul opened the door, Revolver walked through it and burned the house down. 60 years later, played through good speakers, this album still sounds like it was made last week. George Harrison wrote 3 of the best songs on the record: Taxman, Love You Too, and I Wanna Tell You, and each one sounds like a different George. Political, spiritual, frustrated. John retreated into his own mind and came back with Tomorrow Never Knows, built on a single chord and tape loops and passages from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a song unlike anything that had existed before it. Paul wrote Eleanor Rigby, a song about loneliness so precise it could cut glass. Strings only, no guitars, no drums, nothing comforting. And then, on the same album, he wrote Got to Get You Into My Life, a full blast of brass and Motown joy. The range is almost impossible to believe. They stopped touring after Revolver. The album they could never perform live turned out to be the best one they'd ever made. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the most famous album ever made. That's not a casual claim. Sgt. Pepper arrived on June 1st, 1967. The summer of love was building, and the world stopped to listen. Radio stations played it front to back without interruption. People gathered around speakers in living rooms and parks. The concept was simple. The Beatles would pretend to be a different band. That distance freed them to be completely themselves. The result was a kaleidoscope. Orchestras, circus music, Indian meditation, British music hall, psychedelia, all sewn into something that felt like a single unified dream. A Day in the Life closes the album with an orchestral crescendo that builds from nothing to everything, and then a final piano chord, played simultaneously by Lennon, McCartney, Starr, Mal Evans, and George Martin across multiple keyboards, that rings and rings and rings for over 40 seconds, the engineers slowly pushing the faders higher as the sound fades, until you can actually hear the studio air conditioning in the silence underneath. That's the last sound on Sgt. Pepper. The room itself still vibrating. The album didn't just capture the spirit of 1967, it created it, and it never stopped. Magical Mystery Tour. Looser, stranger, more experimental. Magical Mystery Tour came later the same year, and it's Sgt. Pepper's weirder, younger sibling. The one who shows up to dinner with paint on their hands and says something that makes everyone go quiet, and is still somehow the most interesting person there. The TV film it accompanied aired on BBC One on Boxing Day 1967 in black and white, to an audience expecting something celebratory. What they got was surreal, plotless, deliberately confusing. The British press called it a disaster. The music wasn't. Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, 2 of the greatest songs anyone has ever written, were part of this era, both exploring a Liverpool childhood through completely different lenses. Strawberry Fields is impressionistic, uncertain, dissolving. Penny Lane is vivid and precise and cheerful, Paul painting a street corner from the outside. Side by side, they show you both halves of the partnership in 4 minutes each. The rest of the album drifts and spirals. I Am the Walrus is nonsense that somehow means everything. Magical Mystery Tour is the sound of 4 people who have no ceiling left, pushing further into their own heads and not particularly caring whether anyone follows. White Album, 30 tracks, 4 people who could barely stand to be in the same room anymore. The White Album is not a unified vision. It's not a concept album. It's 4 solo albums forced into one binding, and somehow that tension makes it one of the most extraordinary things they ever put out. John went cold and political. Revolution, with rage barely contained. Then Revolution 9, 9 minutes of tape loops and found sound that sounds like a mind cracking open. Paul went warm and melodic. Blackbird, a quiet guitar piece about the American American civil rights movement. Obla di obla da, so deliberately cheerful it made John furious. George finally had room. He'd been writing songs for years that kept getting pushed to the side, and the White Album gave him space. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, with Eric Clapton on lead guitar, is one of the finest things on the whole record. Ringo got one song, Don't Pass Me By, and held everything together behind the kit, even as the people in front of him were pulling apart. The album goes from tender ballad to apocalyptic noise to country parody to avant-garde sound collage, sometimes within 2 tracks of each other. It shouldn't work. It works completely, because sometimes genius doesn't need unity. It just needs enough room to be itself. Yellow Submarine, half soundtrack, half Beatles, and more misunderstood than it deserves to be. Yellow Submarine was tied to the animated film of the same name, a psychedelic fantasy that used Beatles music as its backbone, and proved that animation could be genuinely artistic. The film itself is beautiful, the album is uneven, and that's okay. Side 1 has 6 Beatles tracks, including the stunning George Harrison composition, It's All Too Much, a swirling, expansive piece that sounds like the universe slowly expanding, and Only a Northern Song, sardonic and self-aware. George quietly commenting on his own undervalued place in the band's creative structure. Side 2 is George Martin's orchestral score, beautiful in its own way, but clearly not what anyone was buying Beatles albums for. It's the least essential entry in the catalog, but even the peripheral work of 4 people this gifted contains more invention than most artists' entire careers. Abbey Road, the last album they recorded together, even though Let It Be came out afterward. Abbey Road is a farewell written before anyone admitted it was over, which makes it more beautiful and more painful in equal measure. The sessions were the calmest they'd had in years, some unspoken agreement to be kind to each other one last time. Side 1 delivers individual songs, some of the best they ever made. Come Together is John at his most magnetic, a groove so deep it pulls you in before the words even register. Something is George at his absolute peak, later called by Frank Sinatra the greatest love song of the past 50 years. Then side 2 begins, a long medley, fragments of unfinished songs stitched together into one continuous piece that builds through Golden Slumbers, through Carry That Weight, reaching the end, the only Beatles track where Paul, George, and John each take turns trading 2-bar guitar solos. Paul first, then George, then John, passing the music between them one last time. And then a tiny hidden coda, Her Majesty, barely half a minute, Paul stumbling over himself on the way out the door. They knew it was over. They made it beautiful anyway. If this story feels bigger than just a band to you, then you belong here. Subscribe, because this channel is for people who feel the Beatles, not just listen to them. Let It Be, the album that was never supposed to be an album. It started in January 1969 as a film project. The idea was generous. Strip everything away. Go back to basics, play live in a room. No tricks, no overdubs, just the 4 of them and the songs, cameras rolling. What got captured instead was a band coming apart in front of everyone. Arguments, long silences, cold mornings in a film studio that felt nothing like the places they'd come from. George walked out at one point. They relocated to the basement of Apple Corps headquarters, brought in Billy Preston on keyboards, and something smoothed out. They remembered how to play together. The rooftop concert on January 30th, their last public performance, was spontaneous, interrupted by police, bitterly cold, and completely perfect. Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, 1, After 9:09, played on a rooftop to London office workers looking up from the street in confusion and delight. Phil Spector was later brought in to produce the album from the recordings, and he buried the rawness under orchestral arrangements that infuriated Paul McCartney, especially what Spector did to The Long and Winding Road. A stripped version, Let It Be Naked, came out in 2003. Then in 2021, Peter Jackson's documentary Get Back used restored footage to reframe the whole story, showing not just the tension, but the humor, the warmth, the musical brilliance still fully operating even at the end. Both versions of the album, both versions of the story, same truth. 4 people who changed everything, trying to remember why they started, unable to hold it together for much longer, going out not with silence, but with one last song on a rooftop in the cold. Past Masters, everything they never put on an album. Past Masters is the missing drawer, the place where all the singles, B-sides, and rarities that never fit anywhere else finally found a home in one collection. The British Beatles model was unusual for the time. Singles were kept separate from albums, which meant that some of their biggest hits had never appeared on a standard LP. From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Songs that sold millions and changed the course of music history, living only on 7-inch vinyl until this came out. Past masters fixed that permanently. The collection also includes the long version of Revolution, the original single version of Let It Be before Spector touched it, and Across the Universe in a version that finally does the song justice. Past Masters doesn't tell a story the way the studio albums do. What it does is prove that the story was even larger and richer than the official catalog suggested. The songs that didn't make it onto the albums were still extraordinary. Live at the BBC. Before the polished recordings, before Abbey Road and the tape loops and the orchestras, there was this. Live at the BBC captures the Beatles between 1963 and 1965, performing live sessions for BBC Radio with a looseness and joy that the studio albums rarely had. 69 tracks recorded for radio shows, played fast, live, with the kind of abandon that years of Beatlemania hadn't yet worn away. Covers of Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins and Buddy Holly sit alongside early originals and show clearly where the band came from. They had absorbed American rock and roll so completely they could reproduce it with total authenticity while already adding something that was entirely their own. John cracks jokes between songs. Paul announces tracks with a cheerful professionalism that sounds both sincere and slightly ridiculous. The band sounds like they are having the time of their lives, because they were. This is the Beatles that played 8-hour sets in Hamburg, that performed at the Cavern Club over 300 times, that earned everything through sweat and repetition before the world knew their names. Raw, fast, loud, and completely alive. Anthology 1, the first volume of the most ambitious archive project in rock history. Put together from vaults most people didn't know existed, Anthology 1 covers the early years, from their very first audition tapes in 1962 through the peak of Beatlemania in 1964. You hear them before they were famous, stumbling through Besame Mucho in front of Decca Records executives who decided to pass, working out harmonies in real time, laughing at bad takes, figuring out who they were going to be through the only way that actually works, doing it badly until you can do it well. The outtakes and alternate versions reveal a band that worked harder and experimented more freely than the polished finished records ever suggested. Songs tried in different keys, different tempos, different emotional registers, before landing on the version the world eventually heard. And buried inside Anthology 1 is Free as a Bird, a John Lennon home demo from the late 1970s. His voice recorded on a cheap cassette, transformed through new technology into a full Beatles recording with Paul, George, and Ringo completing what John had started. It sounds like a reunion. It sounds like time travel. It sounds, somehow, like a Beatles song. Anthology 2, the middle period, which means the period when everything changed. Anthology 2 covers the years from Rubber Soul through the White Album, the most creatively explosive stretch in the band's history, and possibly in the history of popular music. Alternate versions of Eleanor Rigby, A Day in the Life, and Strawberry Fields Forever appear here in forms so different from the finished records that they feel like parallel universe versions of songs you already know. Strawberry Fields exists in multiple takes because John kept changing his mind about what the song was. And producer George Martin famously stitched 2 different takes together at different speeds to create the final version, a technical impossibility that somehow worked. Anthology 2 shows you the seams. The second new recording is Real Love, another rescued Lennon demo, quieter and more intimate than Free as a Bird, a love song that sounds addressed to specific people rather than the whole world. Proof that even unfinished John Lennon, caught on a tape recorder in a New York apartment, was better than most people's very best work. Anthology 3, the final chapter of the archive project, covers the Let It Be and Abbey Road sessions, the years when everything was ending and everyone in the room knew it, even if nobody was saying it out loud. Hearing the outtakes from this period is bittersweet in a way the earlier volumes aren't. You can feel the weight in the pauses between takes, the long silences that the finished records edited out. But you can also hear moments of warmth and real collaboration that the standard breakup story tends to leave out. They could still make each other laugh. They could still play together with a precision and musical instinct that no other group of 4 people on Earth could match. George Harrison's demos for All Things Must Pass appear here, a preview of the masterpiece solo album he would release 18 months after the band dissolved. Proof that he'd been quietly holding back an entire career's worth of extraordinary music while waiting for space that never fully came. The anthology ends where the Beatles ended. Not cleanly, not with resolution, but honestly, which is the only way it ever could have. Now and Then. 53 years after they broke up, the Beatles released one final song. The story of Now and Then is almost too strange to believe, which makes it feel right for a band that always did impossible things. It began as a home demo John Lennon recorded on a cassette tape at the Dakota in New York City, around 1977. Just his voice and a piano, rough and intimate. A love song to someone specific that also somehow sounds addressed to everyone. John was killed on December 8, 1980, before anything could be done with it. In the 1990s, during the Anthology project, Paul, George, and Ringo gathered to try to complete it, but the audio technology of the time couldn't separate John's voice cleanly from the piano beneath it. The tape hiss was too dense, the two sounds too tangled. George, who wasn't convinced the song was worth saving, died in 2001, but had recorded guitar parts during those 1995 sessions, just in case. They waited. Then the machine learning technology that Peter Jackson's team developed to restore the Get Back documentary footage made the impossible possible. John's voice was pulled from that cassette with a clarity that sounded like a clean studio take. Paul and Ringo recorded new parts. George's guitar from 30 years earlier was woven in. A string arrangement was added, and the result is quiet, unhurried, and deeply human. A love song across time. John singing to the people he left behind, not knowing he was saying goodbye, not knowing the song would take over 40 years to finish, not knowing that the technology to hear him clearly wouldn't exist until long after he was gone. The last Beatles song sounds exactly like a goodbye written by someone who had no idea it was a goodbye, and that is what makes it, in the end, perfect. This is the first video of a channel fully dedicated to the Beatles. If you believe their story deserves to be told with depth and respect, subscribe and be here from the very beginning. Leave a comment telling me which album means the most to you. I read every single one.